Hello? What just happened? Can you hear us? It's gone quiet.
I can hear you clearly. We're just wondering, get us going, and then I'll take on after you introduce everyone.
Okay, so do you want us to start up now? Are we beginning?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Oh, I could put on my camera too, I suppose. Okay, good morning, everybody, and thanks for those of you who are there in person. Thanks for those who are joining us online as well. This is only our, oh, there's some crackling sound coming through. Okay, this is only our second attempt at these lunchbox convenings, and our first attempt at doing it in a hybrid way. So in time, we'll see whether this is feasible and necessary. Sorry, I'm getting some noise. I don't know, so maybe, I don't know if you can mute it on that side. Okay, can you still hear me? Well, now you've muted, so I can't hear you. But okay, I hope you can still hear me. I can't tell. Okay, thumbs up. Okay, excellent. So I was saying it's our first time trying it in this hybrid way. And so sorry for those of you who are in a big underpopulated classroom, but in time we'll get this right and maybe try and get the balance. But for us, it's worthwhile, I think, to begin offering the possibility for people to meet online and in person. The first one was in person and we were in a packed room. Now we're in a very big empty room, but we'll keep on chugging along. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Geshi Karuri Sabina. I am a visiting associate professor at the Wits School of Governance, and one of my tasks is helping to coordinate Tayarisha, the African Center of Excellence in Digital Governance. The idea for the Lunchbox series was based on an awareness that as we are going along this journey of trying to kick up the center, there isn't a lot of contact with everybody. So some of us, like Zibusiso and I, may see each other almost daily. A few of us who are trying to run some of the mechanics may get together occasionally, but there is also this bigger community of associates that we've invited, of students and other actors who we definitely like to see engage with Tayarisha, who may not hear from us or have contact with us enough to sort of have a sense that there is some energy and there's something going on. But also maybe building up to the possibility of a future where we launch more formal seminar series and activities that everybody can engage with. We thought, why keep waiting? Let's start with something, even if it's a little bit less formal. So this is our second lunchbox. We'll continue to have these monthly. We'll eventually also get it right where the lunch can actually include lunch. We are aware that for those of you at the physical venue, you were not allowed to bring your lunch in. But those are all of the growing pains. It's nice to see some of you in the room. I see Lucy back there. I see Sikhle and Nati online. I see Terge, Halfdan, Melissa. So welcome, 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 all of you. We're also recording, so hopefully this will also be available for others who may want to hear. I did at the last session give a bit of a background about what the Tayarisha Center is and what we're trying to do. I thought perhaps it's not necessary in current company to spend a lot of time on that. We've been, particularly Zibusiso, making a lot of effort to make sure the website is up and that we are posting content there, and we hope to begin being regular about posting updates. So if you don't mind, without further ado, I'd just like to allow us to get into today's agenda rather than giving the whole background. And for today, what we thought we would do is to begin this idea of presenting actual pieces of work that we can engage with. And so we've got what we jokingly call, but it's probably true, our two vice presidents, Rekgotsofetse Chikane and Halfdan Lynge, presenting on a recent book chapter they've done entitled Monitoring in an Era of Algorithmic Governance. So that will be our substantive piece of work for today. We try to keep these sessions to an hour, so I think it's probably good that we get into that. And we hope for those of you who are there physically, you'll have a chance to mingle a bit. And for those of us who are virtual, maybe we'll try to be physical next time, and so we could do the same. So without further ado, I would like to hand over, I believe it's to Rekgotsofetse, and to thank you for being our first sharer in the Lunchbox series, and then just to open up, obviously, to others who are in the space to please consider sharing in these events as we go forward. Over to you, Rekgotsofetse.
Very cool.
Excuse me.
We can see your screen, but we are getting audio from you and from Sikle still. I'm not sure why.
They might be picking up from it. Yeah, so long as they don't say anything, we should be good to go.
There's mics everywhere.
But
Look at the top. There's mics everywhere.
So because I'm also aware that many people might have to leave, I'm not going to take too long. I probably won't go through every single slide. But yeah, you guys can see the presentation. So I hope you can see the presentation and not just myself. So I definitely won't go through every single slide. But we will approach Dr. Lynge and myself a couple months ago at some point to write a chapter around monitoring and evaluation. And it felt a bit odd because neither him nor I are M&E specialists. Maybe Halfdan is moonlighting as an M&E specialist. I'm not entirely sure. But we really sat back and started thinking about how we could possibly contribute to this book. And as the only people in the entire book who probably aren't M&E specialists, we decided to be provocative and decided to poke the bear just a little bit. And decided to ask the question of, does M&E know how to deal with algorithmic governance? Now you can see the title here. We presented this to a conference a couple of weeks ago. So the title says datafication, but the bare bones of it still speaks to our paper. But at the heart of it, we're trying to figure out, my screen can't show, but it's fine, I can leave this around what the impact of algorithmic governance would be on, what the impact of algorithmic governance would be on the field of monitoring and evaluation. And obviously there's quite a few different definitions of it, but what we refer to it as is simply understanding the usage and application of algorithms within public policy and development, right? And the implementation of these algorithms for public policy initiatives, interventions, processes, et cetera, right? We use that definition because it allows us a lot of scope to interrogate the field a lot more rather than being very pedantic around a particular issue. And I should probably say now that we focus more on monitoring more than on the evaluation of things. So the monitoring of processes, the monitoring of processes essentially in the main, right? What we also don't talk about, or what we don't try and refer to, is the governance of algorithms. And we believe it's something important that needs to be done at some point, right? It's one thing understanding how and when algorithms get utilized. The other thing is then who governs the people who utilize them, essentially, who governs the algorithms themselves. And at some point, public policy now needs to start thinking about that, around the same way that you think about who governs data in an organization. The same implications can kind of be transferred to algorithms as well. I won't go through this too much, but essentially data gets used in public policy for many different reasons. Whether it is to consider future policy options, whether it's to inform decision making, but data is primarily used for the maintenance of policies and generation of new policies in different ways, right? So we should all kind of understand this. So we decided to take a step back and ask ourselves the question of, are institutions ready for this impact of algorithmic governance, for the impact of ICT innovations within the state, for the impact of datafication, and we'll talk about why understanding datafication in particular is quite important in this regard. And we decided to say, what are the barriers to the institutional preparedness of an organization, especially on their monitoring systems? And in general, the cost of data collection is generally a prohibitive issue. It has the ICT or the IT infrastructure is one. Often people take it for granted that a lot of government departments just don't have the infrastructure. In the metros, yes. governments, not so much, right? And even if you are in a local government in particular, piece of tech that was put into place that made the department completely technology, right? In local government, one of the annoying legacy systems is called Venus. A lot of local governments like using Venus as a CRM system of sorts. But what Venus does is that all other operations that come out of that CRM system are completely dependent on Venus, right? To the point that if you want to upgrade on it, it becomes really prohibitive to upgrade to something that isn't Venus still, right? So if IBM gets a contract, they kind of stay with that contract for the rest of their lives. And the question then becomes, how do you improve your services when you have to deal with these legacy systems as well? We also understand that there's a chasm between how data practitioners kind of function and how they understand data generation and how they utilize data compared to monitoring experts, right, or monitoring specialists. And it becomes an interesting issue that our chapter started focusing on in particular, around the different philosophies and methodologies between data scientists in particular, as well as monitoring specialists, and understanding what these differences are and what they look like within institutions. Now, I realize that Halfdan is in the room, so you could probably speak to this a lot better than I could. But what we do know is that data is exponentially increasing in its generation across the world. Both structured and unstructured data is exponentially increasing. If you know what is, and Halfdan, you must step in if I get this wrong, but a zettabyte is what, 1 million gigabytes, if I'm not mistaken, something along those lines, something like that. Generation within the state, because forces the state and public policy to try and sit back and say, how do we contend and take advantage of this datafication boom in society? Right? In concurrence with this is that we also know that the processing power of our computers are also increasing rapidly. A really good example right now is watching Apple is a fantastic little exercise. And watching all their presentations, and they just recently launched their new MacBook. And this is their new state-of-the-art MacBook using what they call the M2 chip. Now, the importance of the M2 chip, we can speak about it for many, many hours. But the real importance is that the M2 chip came out almost a year and a bit after the M1 chip. And the M1 chip was seen as the most state-of-the-art computer processor on the market, right? Not because of it by itself, but because of how it intermeshed with the entire MacBook system, right? But the real interesting thing is that Apple was able to do this in a year, right? But an M3 chip will come out, making that laptop even more powerful than it was before. And this trend has been continuing for many, many years now. So the question then becomes, you know you've got a ton of data now, you've become even better at processing this information. You know the private sector is doing it. You know the private sector is understanding how we utilize this to better monitor the way people behave. The question then becomes, how does the state take advantage of that? And should they be taking advantage of it? So I'm going to skip this slide. And most people kind of know what the traditional cycle of public policy is. What I would rather have you focus on is this one. And it's kind of the basis of our argument. That because of the impact of datafication in particular within society, and with datafication, the usage of data, and with the usage of data, the development of increasingly sophisticated algorithms. Oh, something important.
Hello, have we lost you?
No, we're just sorting out. Apparently you couldn't see me the entire time. I'm not sure why you need to see me. Oh, this is why. I see what Ziva did. Okay, we're back. So, sorry, I am back now. So there was a question around where does the cycle start? And that's the entire purpose of it. because of the advent of datafication, there's no end or start point when it comes to data. I mean, when it comes to public policy formulation. At least that's what it hypothetically would look like. That there isn't a traditional, okay, the agenda sets, the agenda is set now, so the Department of Science and Technology sits down and says, what are our priorities? How do we list them? You can now find your priorities instantaneously from the public because they're telling you real time, essentially, right? And that's why this needs you to start be thinking about what you understand as public policy, right? And we kind of know this. The implications of it, we said, okay, how does this apply to M&E in particular?
Can you do my last few slides? Because this is the meat of the paper.
So we separated the field of public policy or government system into three particular areas. The first one is the external context, how M&E specialists and data scientists both contend with the political context in which they exist, right? And how that impacts the processes, the decisions of what systems you're supposed to use, the decisions around what approach you use to evaluating processes, to monitoring systems. A lot of that has political connotations in different ways, and we'll show you how it is quite different for a monitoring specialist as well as a data scientist. The other one is the internal context. And the internal context here speaks to the practical implementation of systems, right? So brick and mortar issues and processes within a department and how a monitoring specialist deals with that and how a data scientist would do. And the other one is how you then generate your data, right? The actual activity that you use to go and generate your data, the types of experiments that you use, the methodologies that you would put into place. So you probably won't be able to see this. It's not the greatest slide in the world, but I could probably improve it, but that's a problem for 2023. But we understand that for evaluators, now I hope my laser pointer. Cool. So we understand for evaluators, in particular, at a macro context, there's a relationship that they have with both the stakeholders who are involved with the department. The stakeholders here can refer to other government departments, can refer to political organizations, can refer to non-state actors, who are all looking for different ways to evaluate and monitor particular policies that affect society as a whole. Right? So we generally understand that those interrelationships will inform the types of priorities that the department would have, the focus that an evaluator or monitoring specialist would have. For data scientists, it's slightly different, and we might be taking a lot of leeway here, so very open for questions. But for a data scientist, there's a couple of things they need to contend with. One is within the public sector, there's the politics of data generation and use. Unlike a private company, the state, the private companies really should be limited as well, but the state is a lot more limited in how it collects and how it surveys individuals in order to collect their information. There's a higher moral responsibility to citizens, right, to treat them like a human, essentially, and not as a product. Right. So as a data scientist working in that field, you need to be able to contend with that. And with that comes bigger macro political issues such as privacy, surveillance issues. What are you doing with the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern how data is generated, why it's generated, how it gets utilized, how you get consent? POPIA becomes an interesting piece of legislation that is beyond the scope of this. Aware than a monitoring or evaluating specialist, right? So there's that chasm at the macro. At a meso level, maybe not meso, but at a practical implementation level, for an evaluator, there's many considerations. These activities, resource optimization, the capabilities to use this evidence, there's many different issues that you have to contend with as an evaluator, at least in our opinion. But for data scientists, it's quite different. Remember, these two fields are going to be coming into contestation with each other. So we need to understand what the differences are and how we bring them together. For data scientists, what they really focused on, and we might be simplifying their job a lot here, but it is quite complex, is the governance of data, right? The management of data, understanding how data gets used, how it moves through an organization. Often people kind of forget the governance of data often involves how information moves within an organization, right? How it gets through certain bottlenecks, how you open up its usage to certain users, why certain people have usage of that information. It manages the relationship between departments, between individuals, right? When you're thinking about monitoring from a data scientist perspective, it's less about the nuts and bolts, but more about the zeros and ones, right? If I had to make a cheesy joke like that. At a scientific data usage level, right, so the generation of information, we know that for an evaluator, for a monitoring specialist, it is about how do we generate our information ourselves, how do we physically generate data through our evaluations, through our work. What types of interventions do we use? They'll have a very clear-cut theory of change that informs that. And what would those change mechanisms look like based on the data that you collect, right? These hands-on interventions. For data scientists, it's really about the scope of the data and the domain in which your data kind of sits in, right? It becomes like a sandbox and becomes a fascinating place where everything that generates data you can utilize to make informed decisions. I skipped over the slide previously around bad ways about more about it here. But the techniques that a data scientist will use to generate information based on the algorithms that apply into a particular process is not limited to an exact intervention that is monitored. Whatever information kind of sits or resides within the state can be utilized. The state sits on mountains and mountains and mountains of administrative data that they have no idea what to do with. Right? Use to help streamline processes, whether it's payroll, whether it's CRM, whether it is understanding behaviors of particular citizens without putting their names on it. There's a million ways in which you can improve your processes by the data that you already have. You don't have to go out and generate information yourself. So we have a few implications of this. And there's other aspects of this paper that I might just skip this because of time and I want everyone in the room. But what we do know is that we understand that because of the increasing power of datafication, because of the increasing processing power of computers, we understand that algorithms are becoming increasingly sophisticated. We understand that there might be a gap between data scientists and evaluators. And we now understand, at least we wrote down what that gap looks like. The next test is how do we bring them closer together? At the talk I was giving a couple of weeks ago in front of evaluators and M&E specialists, I think they thought I was telling them they're going to get out of the job. And I wanted to say yes, but I also wanted to leave the room. But these vital skills that they have, they think differently because they have to, because they still deal as one of the panelists at that event, and someone who critiques this, really, really good critiques of our chapter, essentially says, where's the human element at the end of the day, right? So what we do understand is that there is indeed going to be a shift towards algorithmic governance, right? Because of the advances of ICT technology. We understand that. We understand that big data is going to allow us to understand transactional data sets a lot better. It's going to allow us to produce information as peers, right? The state is not the only one who can give out services, right? Based on the data that's available. Of innovation, right? Not just in the private sector, but in the public sector. And the question is, how do you then take advantage of what the state is doing? I mean, what citizens are doing and putting that into the state without the tedious process of sort of tendering process, for instance. After we know what I'm leading towards here. What we understand is that once this shift, there needs to be a redesign of governance structures within the state, especially around monitoring and evaluation specialists, right? A way that understands how to both take advantage of data generated from human to human interactions, right? Human and state interactions, as well as data created purely off transactional data sets, administrative data sets that have no humans there, And how do you bring that all to the forefront? So I probably did not do this as much justice as I could. But what we do know is that datafication is changing our societies. We also understand that it's fundamentally affected. Maybe we haven't proven fundamentally. Fundamentally is probably a strong word, but we know it's affected monitoring of policies, and we understand that the utilization of data to monitor the performance of different policies and public institutions is probably one of the most promising, exciting aspects of the digital age. So that's me. I'm not sure if there's many questions. I also realized that I couldn't see the chats at all. So if anyone was putting any comments in that chat, I do apologize.
Clap.
Listening to. Oh, perfect. And I'll stop. Cool. Thanks, Gretchen. I'm going to hand it back to you. I hope you heard me to that entire process. Otherwise, that's very embarrassing.
No, thank you. The only chat comments so far were about the technical difficulties we were having. Your audio kept shifting, I think, between mics or something. But I think we did manage to catch most of what you said, and we did have good view to the slides. So thanks, Rekgotsofetse. I think this is a super interesting presentation. And I think this whole field, I think that you're engaging with, which I gather in part has to do as well with digital capabilities and hybridity. So when you're looking across these two disciplines and how they see the issues and how they relate to each other, I think it's super interesting and becomes very important as we think about governance, to the extent governance is not something outside of the people, the communities, the institutions that execute. I want to first maybe hand over to Halfdan to see if he wants to add anything as a co-author on the paper. And then I'd like to just open up for engagement, but thank you so much for the great presentation. Halfdan, any additions from you before we open up for Q&A?
Thanks for that, Geshi. No, I don't have anything to add. I did hear my name mentioned a few times, but yeah, there were a little bit of an issue with the sound. There was one concrete question about what is a zettabyte, and it's actually 1 trillion gigabytes. So it's 1 followed by 21 zeros. So just to clarify, we are talking unbelievably large numbers here. But no, let me not take time. I would rather perhaps we open up and see if there are any comments or questions, and we can take it from there.
Great, thanks, Halfdan. I'm going to rely on you, Rekgotsofetse, in terms of whether there are any physical hands in the room, because we can't see the room anymore. I'm just seeing the online participants. Okay, now I can see you and Zibusiso, but not the room, which is fine. But if there are hands up there, and if by show of hands there are any questions, you can just let me know. I don't see any online for now, but I'd like to lead with one question, which is, I'm fascinated by the table you had, and that's why I guess I went to this point about new digital capabilities or transformations. And I just had more of a methodological question about, as you're doing those comparisons, about how data scientists see it and how M&E, more conventional M&E people see it. I was curious on methodology behind that. So was this, is this sort of more speculative, you're sort of exploring these ideas just through literature, or is there or will there be any primary work to sort of engage? I mean, we've got people like Turkey here who clearly can speak on the one side of that, and at the school we do have people who speak to the more traditional side. So yeah, if you could just say something about methodology in terms of how we come up with some of these ideas about how the two sides see things across these three domains. That would be my question. Are there any questions in the room? Let's start by looking there.
Yeah, so that's that.
So I'm going to get out soon, but wanted to quickly ask 2 questions. The first is around come closer.
Can you hear me?
Maybe if I just stand under one of the mics, they can hear. Ooh, Geshi, you're talking, but we can't hear you. He's on mute.
Sorry, I was saying yes, we can hear very well.
Does it?
And now we can't hear. What just happened? We could hear her very well, then it went off.
Experimental.
I'm not going to touch it. Go ahead.
Experimental.
Yeah.
Then she can't hear. And then, where's the meeting point and how we see then the monitoring specialist kind of adopting the way of thinking and using data specialist ways of analyzing information? So it's a table at the moment, but I was like, if it were like a Venn diagram, what would be in the middle?
Yeah. In case you didn't hear, so it's just a question of where do data scientists and any specialists kind of fit together? So let me start with Geshi's question. Let me start this one question I believe in. So it's hermeneutics is a nice fancy word for like a quick way of understanding something, and some of them is a process such as a experimental evaluation that we are always going to use an RCT, or we know we're going to use a regression discontinuity test of some sort. Like these particular processes that people will just use as a way of generating data. Where they come together, I might actually say not where monitoring specialists come and meet data specialists, but actually where data specialists meet monitoring specialists. I think that becomes more important. And I take that position based off the really Professor Everett has given us really good insight from his perspective. I wouldn't call him a traditionalist. He said we're doing the exact same thing, except they're the ones knocking on the doors. Your job, what a data specialist can do really, really well is if we're not allowed into that door, how do we find out more about what's happening in that household using census data, for instance? Now, then we pose many questions to knock on that door, but it's about now as you're doing this transition and bringing their philosophies and practices in. What that Venn diagram or intersection looks like, no idea. It's designed that way, and it's kind of based off Geshi's. So the way we created this framework was taking two different texts. So you can see it talks about in the textbook, forgetting the author's names, but there's two different frameworks that we've essentially merged together. We have another diagram that kind of showed how we merged them together, but it's not in these slides, and my laptop's not connected, otherwise I would just show it. So we use two theoretical frameworks for M&E in particular. And then our understanding based on another paper about how data scientists kind of have been functioning within governments. That paper was taken from the NYU GovLab work in particular. Three approaches into one to try and understand particular exercises, particular philosophies, and the political context. So that's how we put it in. To test it would be the next step. Because right now is what we think the difference looks like. M&E guys so far, they said there was a lot of questions around the data side, but not many around how we've conceptualized M&E specialists in particular. But it stands, it has to be tested, but that's how we've theoretically put it together.
Are you still speaking?
I was, and then I saw Toby's hand, and then I took over the chair responsibility, so I apologize. So I'll give it back.
Oh, no, it's okay. There's actually a bigger problem because the audio has become so bad that we probably heard, if I had to put a percentage to it, maybe 50% of what you just said. So if there's anything that can be done in the room to sort out the audio, that would really help. From what we are seeing, it looks like any other mic in the room just picks up and it just keeps moving.
So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to, there's one other person in the room, so this makes it easy. I'm just going to move the mic onto the laptop's mic.
Yes, or go into the room and use the same mics that it's picking up. I'm not sure, but if you could do something. So I think what I heard from what you said is that this is a theoretical model informed by some interviews and comparing some frameworks papers, but that it still needed to be tested. I think that's what at least I heard from what you said. We didn't hear very much of it. Maybe actually only 30% of what you said. But we'll come back to you if that's not a correct summary of what your response was. Turge, your hand is up. Could we have you come in? And you're welcome.
Thanks so much, KJ, and thanks so much for presentation. I really enjoy it. Just a question or your view about the recent trends and how this would be fitting into the interfacing with the data within organizations. The data scientists, I like how you just compare them and based on the certain frameworks, but it seems like the majority of the work of the data scientists can be really automated. And so that the field really going into the direction that rather than looking into the data scientists as a separate unit and from the human perspective and just design it as a technology that can be interfaced with the outsiders, so that it's more about creating an interface that can use the natural languages to query the data and to answer the certain questions. At the back end, there will be definitely some technologies that will be automated, etc. And how do you see that human-computer interaction can actually fit into this picture? And where you may have an assumption that you have the full technology that can actually interface with an ordinary person who really doesn't need to understand the technology of the harnessing, the modeling the data, etc. But the technology is able to create the interface that can understand the ordinary questions and answer those questions, create the answers. It's more like a HCI perspective.
Yeah, perfect. So now, is that clear?
Yes, we can hear you.
We're still fine. Let me just double check. Halfdan, do you have any comments before I jump in? Repeat.
No, I'm having the same sound issues as Geshi. So I'm struggling a little bit on this side here.
So I think Rekgotsofetse is asking whether you have any comments on Turge's question about the extent to which you think advances in human-computer interfaces and interactions might actually change this problem, in the sense that the technology itself could begin to interface and be used through automation to in a way neutralize some of these differences as you're seeing them now, and whether you see any prospects of that changing this equation a bit.
Okay, now I get it. Thanks for the summary, Geshi. So I guess your sound is better than mine, suggesting that there's also issues on my side. No, it's a great question, Turkey. Thank you for that. I suppose you are right to some extent that this is a question of developing better interfaces that would then lower the sort of technical knowledge or skills required on the side of evaluators or M&E specialists. But at the same time, I think it's fundamentally important that there's an understanding of what goes on inside that black box. I mean, there's a lot of issues right now about algorithmic transparency, which is this idea that we cannot just kind of like trust that whatever happens inside the black box is to the benefit of the public. We need to understand what goes on inside, and it's not sufficient that it's only data scientists to understand what goes on inside. Actually, you know, and this is beyond now. I mean, we're discussing this in the context of evaluators and M&E specialists, but it's something I think is important for sort of the public sector in general, that they have to have a fundamental understanding of applied. I mean, because I tend to see this as data science is really sort of the interface between applied statistics, computer science, and some kind of thematic expertise. And it's extremely important that future policymakers, future public servants actually have that basic understanding of data science, of applied statistics, of computer science. They don't need to be able to, you know, write the code, etc., but they have to understand the basic principles in order to ask the right questions. So yes, I do think that some of these barriers will be removed with time, but I still think it's fundamentally important that, again, M&E specialists have an understanding of what happens on the other side and are able to communicate with the data scientists. I think that would be my answer to that question.
Thanks, Halfdan. Just a response to that, Gechi, am I allowed to respond to Halfdan?
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Go ahead.
Interesting question here. So Halfdan just raised an important issue. I believe that what you are referring to, the part of the interface, the HCI that I was actually referring to, that will be feeding back to the M&E specialists. And regarding to the bias and the understanding the black box nature of the data science, I think that is really difficult aspect. And for example, from a technology perspective, you can really make the decisions explainable. And but the decisions, that explainability would be depending on the complexity of the inputs that decisions is taking as input to reach an outcome. And so in some cases, the explainability would be referring to thousands of the if then else rules, because I'm taking this decision because A, B, C are greater than that, etc. Those can be interpreted, but at the end, the question is whether the decision makers would be just looking into those interpretations and understanding it. Most of the time, I believe that that will be somewhat, if it is not in a very simple format, it will be then ignored. And it is still explanations or the black box, unresolving the black box nature of the decisions. If it's another in a very simple format, then it will be creating another complexity from my perspective. So we have the similar technology hypes in time that have taken place, like 2000, early 2000, then we had this databases just coming up, and then we were just talking about the business analysts, we were just talking about the harnessing the databases, etc. So at the end, there was a technology expert that will be just taking the questions and giving the answers. And I see that this data science hype is no different than what we have seen so far. And the question is why we should be worrying about making something understandable, like a black box nature of the data science that we are all talking about. Why we should be caring about making it a black box? That's the question. Would it be the responsibility of the data scientist or the technology behind this? Or should we be worrying about it is a big question that we really need to have a debate on? And at the end, from the unresolving the black box nature of these technologies, it's another straightforward task. It actually creates another layer of the complexity. And I totally agree with Halfdan in terms of the issue on the how these decisions are arrived and why it is important for the policy makers to understand how the decisions are arrived. But in some cases, it won't be a straightforward task. And they need to just take it granted and accept it in some cases as it is. So the question is whether we should be focusing on the just basic understanding, as Halfdan said, and focusing on the creating a good interface with the technology to answer the certain questions that can be used by the M&E specialists, rather than just focusing on the creating this terminology that can be shared by the both parties. It will be an interesting debate, and I think it will be an interesting hype to see how this will be ending up, and in next 5 to 10 years. And I'm really looking forward how this will be developing.
Thanks, Tage. So I'm happy for Halfdan to come back on this one. I see his hands up, and we can also come back to the room. What I partly heard in what you're saying, though, Tage, I think you're also opening up a bigger question, which is the extent, like when we talk about protocols and transparency, and for me, this is a real governance question, is in a way how we understand those issues and what, at a minimum at least, one should expect out of that. But let's hear what Halfdan has to say, and maybe we'll pick up on that after.
Thanks for that, Geshe, and again, thanks, Turkey. I enjoyed your comments, and I agree with you that certainly the interfaces, we can get far by improving the interfaces. Ultimately the task is to sort of narrow the gap that exists between, again, data scientists, applied statisticians, computer scientists, etc., and I will broaden again the scope here a little bit and say policymakers, decision makers in the public sector, etc. I think the interfaces certainly, but I think they, and perhaps now I'm talking from the perspective of the Vid School of Governance, we have an important responsibility in terms of making future policymakers understand what the implications are here, which means they have to have at least a very basic understanding, because, and Geshe, you mentioned transparency is one thing, but there's a whole other question around accountability. Ultimately, the decision makers will have to take responsibility for decisions that are taken perhaps even automatically as a consequence of data science, and they have to take responsibility. They're accountable for these decisions, and that means they have to understand what it is they're putting their name on. So it really is a complex space, and yes, perhaps short term we are better. It's more efficient perhaps to invest in improving the interfaces, but there are fundamental questions around transparency and accountability and sort of broader democratic implications that we need to consider here. I'll stop here. Thank you, Geshe.
Okay, I see there's a hand on Zibusiso's side.
Yeah, it's just, I just wanted to add, we'll give 3 quick examples at various levels of why we don't need to know what's in the black box and situations when we do. So the one would be, yesterday I was on Twitter and the city of Joburg Power, City Japan, came out and said all the platforms using our data to tell people about so applications like S-Coms and Push. And that really frustrated me because there's a very simple solution to that. But more important is that Twitter account in particular, if you had the right type of interface that did, what's that word I want? Data, not data mining. Essentially, anyway, people's tweets with the reference numbers. You wouldn't need a human agent. In real time, you can give responses, you can understand where outages are. You see a particular response, you automatically feed back into the city pipe. All of that can be completely automated. What the decision making process of which tweets, based on how you understand the language of that tweet, whether it's angry or not, what reference code, whatever, all of that could be simplified. The person on the end doesn't need to know how that happened, they just know it well. A second situation, social workers. So there's an example of this, I think it's Leeds in the UK. With how, whether it is child abuse cases, whether it is whatever happening in a household at any particular moment in time. So whatever particular time, a social worker is collecting data about that household. But if that social worker could collect the data of that household using an interface that is in real time speaking to what other social workers are doing, not just in that community, but that area as well, in order to make decisions, not just based on what a social worker is seeing, but based off what is generally happening to the children who have social workers coming to their household in real time to make those types of decisions about what you do in a moment of crisis. Now, you don't need to know the black box, and I hope my sound is coming out here, but there needs to be leeway for the social worker to understand how the system is making its recommendations to you, which becomes quite fascinating. And the most obvious one would be the black box. To know what's in the black box is for census data. But like I said, Professor Edward gave the example of they go there because he helps manage the census. They go and they knock on doors. They physically talk to a human being, and yes, they've got other processes to collect online, but you physically talk to a human being. You could collect the data of that household, how many people are in that household, their average expenditure, how many children are there, what schools they go to. You can find that information yourself as a state if you knew how to organize the data. So the question then would be from general citizens who the state is responsible to, how would you do that? So the census data were very clear. They have to publish their findings, they have to publish their methodologies, they have to publish the format of how they got to certain conclusions and collected information. And the question then becomes for data scientists, is the onus of responsibility for that transparency equally applicable? That you can't just say that, we're just going to use it in space. So I think it's an amazing debate. I'm sorry I was speaking so long, but I think it's an amazing debate. And I think at different levels, the level of transparency will differ as well. I really hope you could hear me this time. Otherwise, we are never coming back to this last issue. Never.
I think I'm with you on that last bit. We're possibly never coming back to the class. I just heard that we were actually the first ones perhaps to use it in this format. That would have been good information to have before, because I think the second part we could hear what you said. The first part we hardly heard anything. So I think we got the gist of what you're saying, and I was actually making a note saying something very similar, that probably it's the size of that black box also matters, and there's several levels, as you're saying, at which one might ask questions, what data or information, who is doing it, how are choices or decisions being made, what's the oversight, and who decides all of the above? Who's actually thinking through as we think about this. So it's not a singular question about what needs to be transparent, but I think Halfdan makes the accountability point about who has to be able to answer for the output of this at the end of the day. But I think I see we're coming to time, and I really appreciate that we've begun to scratch into something that participants are feeling is exciting and worth pursuing, whether through debate or further research. And I guess this is exactly what we hope to do through these little short conversations. And so I'd just like to thank very much Rekgotsofetse and Halfdan for sharing your paper, to thank Sergey, Sichle, and others for beginning to engage with it. And I guess I hope, because we're still a small community for now, we hope that some of these things can be taken up directly by those who have a direct interest. So Sergey, I hope that you'll feel welcomed to engage with the authors directly, and we can also see if there's any appetite for taking up issues further, whether bilaterally or through the center. We welcome you to think about that. And I'll probably just close by saying that from a Tayarisha perspective, we are bringing on some capacity. We've got a couple of postdocs joining us soon, and that will certainly allow us to begin being perhaps more, more active, but also to reach out more in terms of beginning to share more, beginning to engage more with the people who are interested in the community. So we welcome you to look out for that. We'll continue having the lunch boxes monthly. For now, I believe we're looking at first Thursdays. So Zibusisa will correct me if I'm wrong, but we should be looking at having our next session, I think, on the 4th of August at the same time. We'll certainly try to look for a venue that has less technical issues, but we'll probably try at least once more for the hybrid approach, because it does offer some flexibility. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending, to wish you all a fantastic afternoon. And yeah, let's keep on trying to I guess to govern better and to engage with these exciting emerging issues. Thanks, everybody. Go well. And to those who are in the room, enjoy your lunch once you get to it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.